one of the board ops over there in the studio, Stephanie, and she was doing her Tony the Tiger impression. So I figured that maybe I would spare her embarrassment and just take just not have that part of the video there. I wanted to follow up on something we talked about today, though, because it's really important, I think. We were talking about how in Exodus 23 today, how this is actually kind of showing the structure that you have in the Ten Commandments, right? And so I was making the point that, well, if you consider what you have here in Exodus 23, this is kind of grouping together. The seventh and eighth commandments. I'm just going off the numbering right now that we use in our Lutheran tradition. It's the same thing in the Catholic tradition. It all follows Augustine. But yeah, the idea of you shall not steal and you shall not bear false witness being connected to each other. And then further on, the stuff about the Sabbath, the idea that the Sabbath is actually connected to the idea of the prohibition against coveting, right? Those are all connections that you can see and you can make sense of if you understand the structure that we have in Exodus chapter 20, which is kind of confusing because it's different from the one that you have in Deuteronomy 5, right? Because in Deuteronomy chapter 5, you get the Ten Commandments. They're given again, but they're kind of explained differently. So this is like, I just pulled this up on the screen here, Deuteronomy chapter 5 here. And I'm not trying to say that, Deuteronomy 5 contradicts Exodus 20. They certainly don't. But they do have different perspectives, kind of like in the same way that like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have different perspectives. So similarly, Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20 have different perspectives. And I think they're both helpful. And it's really cool, actually, that we have both perspectives. Helps us appreciate the Ten Commandments more in the same way that the four Gospels help us understand and appreciate everything that our Lord did more. So having redundancy, having some different perspectives is actually all just a good thing here. But so what do you get uniquely then in the perspective of Exodus chapter 20? Okay. So first of all, the numbering that you get in Exodus chapter 20 is different from what we're used to. If you go and you look just really carefully at Exodus chapter 20, you'll kind of be surprised by how it lines up the Ten Commandments. Because there are 10. Now, don't get me wrong. There are 10, but they're not really what you necessarily would think of them, right? Because in our tradition, we're used to thinking them. The first commandment is, you shall have no other gods, right? And that's fine. That's good. But that's a little bit of a harmonization between Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20. What do you get when you just let Exodus 20 be Exodus 20? Okay. Well, this is what you get. The first commandment, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Period. Well, colon, but we'll talk about that in a second. That's the first commandment. Then the second commandment then would follow. I mean, now where exactly you draw the line, you could debate about it, but I think that's probably where you draw the line. And then in verse 3, Exodus 20, verse 3, this is the second commandment then. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that's in heaven above or that's in the earth beneath or that's in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Second commandment. Then the third commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And then the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So these are the first 4 commandments according to Exodus 20. And why am I saying that? Well, if you're following along on Facebook, or YouTube, because this is not thy strong word. This is like after hours, after the bonus of what happens after thy strong word here. But so if you're looking at this on the video here, you can see I've got this, assuming that the video is cooperating. Yeah, I've got this highlighted throughout. The Lord your God. That's a 2-word expression in Hebrew. It's Yahweh Aloha in the Hebrew. That's the key. See, like people would say, well, okay, now hang on, Pastor AJ. Like, how can you say that this is the ordering in Exodus chapter 20? It's not like they put numbers there. Those verse numbers, those are artificial. Well, you're right. But you know what's not artificial? Is the use of Yahweh Eloheka, the Lord your God. Because for the first 5 commandments, this is very deliberate, for the first 5 commandments in Exodus chapter 20, the phrase Yahweh Eloheka occurs exactly once in each of the commandments. You see, and this is actually very key. You have to understand that this was originally preserved in oral tradition. Of course, Moses wrote stuff, or it says actually God wrote stuff on those clay tablets, right? But the things that we have in the manuscript tradition, like that are written on papyrus and on animal skin, right? That stuff is a later stage. So what you would have had was, you would have had the stone tablets that God originally wrote, stone tablets which were destroyed when the Ark of the Covenant was probably destroyed at some point in history. But that didn't mean that we lost the 10 Commandments because they were being preserved orally. And so you got to understand that when you have something in oral tradition that's being preserved, one of the things that keeps everything tight and organized is using patterns like this. It's kind of a poetic quality. And so one of the patterns here in Exodus 20 is the use of the phrase, the Lord your God. And that's actually only one of the patterns. There are some other ones. But they're actually, this is the phrase that basically keeps each of the commandments distinct. So when you get to honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, that's the 5th commandment then, which is kind of, it's interesting for several reasons. But when you lay it out like this anyway, what happens? What happens then? This is sort of interesting then. So we just said here that's 5 commandments, right? So then what are our last 5? Well, this is what you got. And maybe we'll talk about this at some other time. The next commandment, the 6th commandment, is actually still you shall not commit adultery, because in your English version here, those are switched. This is a harmonization with Deuteronomy chapter 5. Exodus 20 probably originally put adultery first for important reasons. I mean, important reasons in the big scheme of things, but in Exodus 20, it doesn't actually really matter that much. The next thing would be murder then, 7th. Then 8th would be you will not steal. 9th then will be you will not bear false witness against your neighbor. And then finally, the 10th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. And house here, this is important. In Exodus 20, house means like the same thing that Joshua said. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. In this context here, it doesn't refer to, 4 walls and a roof. How could it? They're in the wilderness. They don't have houses, right? No, house means household, which is extremely natural then, because the very next thing is just an elaboration. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant, a female servant, ox, donkey, or anything that's your neighbor's. Kind of more like any one that's your neighbor's. It's people and the animals. That's his house. You'll not covet that, his house. So it's just one commandment, which is in fact what you get in the Gospels then, or not necessarily the Gospels, I mean in Luke anyway, but when you look at the New Testament, for instance, Paul, it's, where is it in Paul, if I can remember? It's, that's right, it's in Romans 13. He says, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. Right? That's actually referring to what was probably the original Exodus 20, where adultery comes first, then murder, then stealing. We'll talk about why he skips over false witness in a second. And then finally, you shall not covet as just one commandment that just kind of explains everything, right? So that's the structure that you have in Exodus 20. And there's, like I said, there's a different structure in Deuteronomy chapter 5 that is very good, and it's not like less valid, even if it is maybe more of like a kind of midrash commentary. It might not be as original if you were to look at it that way. If you were just to ask me the question, like, which version do I think that God thundered out of his mouth on the mountain, I would say probably the version that's in Exodus 20. And that the version in Deuteronomy 5 is kind of more like a sermon teaching tool, kind of like the cool new poster edition to kind of help us understand it, right? Not that it's less inspired. It's totally inspired. But, I mean, God doesn't need to say everything in the same order every time, does he? No. God certainly didn't only speak the Ten Commandments this one time, put it to you that way, even though he did thunder it in a very particular way on the mountain. So then the last couple things I just wanted to talk about briefly. So I mentioned, why does Paul in Romans 13 skip over you shall not bear false testimony against your neighbor. I'll just pull it up here, right? Here's where he's talking about the commandments. Romans chapter 13 there. He's talking about, there it is, right? Adultery, murder, steal, covet. And then this is congenial to our conversation today that we had. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? This is a summary, especially that second the second table as we traditionally group it. So what's going on then? Well, what's going on is that you have this really cool correspondence in Exodus 20, and this is why the structure matters, and why it's not just like me being a language nerd. It's certainly me being a language nerd, but it's more than that. I promise. So what you have then is you have this cool correspondence where the first commandment and the fifth commandment are not commands. None of them are commands. They're really kind of like preambles or headings. So you see this here? This first commandment, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, is sort of like the title of the first table. That traditionally it's broken down into 2 tablets. We don't know if it was actually like that. The best theory actually is that Moses carries 2 tablets because there's 2 complete copies of the contract, and which just makes sense, right? I mean, like when I get a contract today, both parties get a copy of the contract, and it's a copy of the whole contract. So likely it's not that. However, it's probably the case that there was a front side that had these commandments about the name of God, and then there was a back side that didn't, that had the rest of the back half, right? The kind of the front 9, the back 9 kind of thing, if you're a golfer. Similarly, so I think that's actually true about what was going on. Each tablet was complete, but that there's one side, the front side, that kind of is more directly about the name of God, and the second side a little bit less so. So on your front side here, there's your first commandment, and it's just kind of telling you, hey, this is who God is, and that way it's kind of a summary of everything that follows, right? Of all these commandments about God's name, but it's also a commandment in its own right. Commandment in the sense of it is an authoritative. It's an authoritative decree of someone who is in command. And this is important actually, because the word commandment is misunderstood. It's not the same as the word command. These are not the 10 commands, the 10 orders. They are the 10 authoritative statements by somebody who is in command, Commander Yahweh, right? That's kind of how the Bible talks about him. Of course, that's very wordy, so we say the 10 commandments, but we got to make sure we understand that the right way. So the first commandment, authoritative saying, that's the word in Hebrew, right? It's kind of saying or word. Is just this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then the things that follow are these elaborations. So that's how you then get, you shall have no other gods, or images or idols, or idol worship, none of that. And you get your I the Lord your God am a jealous God. There's the Lord your God statement for your second commandment. Then your third commandment there, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And there's your bit. The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, right? So there's your third commandment there. Am I losing count already? Sorry. There's your fourth commandment. So first is the title. Second commandment, idolatry. Third commandment, swearing by God's name. Fourth commandment, Sabbath day. And then the fifth commandment is also like a title or like a heading. And in fact, this is actually really cool. It's like the heading or the title for the second half. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. So again, just like the other title, what's it mention? The land, right? So like the title of each side of the commandments is about living well so that we can hold on to the land. God giving us the land, which is a gospel message, really, that God gives it to us. But what's also interesting is that even though God's name is invoked here in the fifth commandment, according to Exodus 20, also it's mentioned a different parent, not just our heavenly Father, but our actual earthly father and mother. And this is, I think, the key. And I didn't realize this forever. The second half of the commandments are all the things that your mother and father should have taught you. You know that phrase like, hey, didn't your mother or father teach you any better, right? It's because, seriously, you didn't need to go up to Mount Sinai to learn you shall not murder. You didn't need to hear God thundering from the mountain to get you shall not steal. We all knew somewhere that was a bad idea, right? Or at least that wasn't very nice. See, so actually, that's why it kind of works as a title here, because you honor your father and your mother when you refrain from murdering or adulterating or stealing or any of those things, because you're just doing what they taught you. You're honoring your parents in all of these things that are on the back half of the commandments. So, that's really cool that you've got like these different kind of titles here and these different connections now. Because then you can line this up and you can say, okay, hey, look, so we've got the heading that's like, God's name took you out of Egypt. And then on the back side, you've got, honor your father and mother by doing these things here, right? And now you have correspondences. Because the second commandment then, which is against idolatry, corresponds with you shall not murder and you shall not commit adultery. And that's maybe easier to see in terms of adultery because throughout the Old Testament, idolatry is constantly compared to adultery. I mean, left and right. Like, why have you been faithless to me when I am your husband? And, you've gone, whoring after the nations and made yourself a prostitute. I mean, that's like the prophets all over the place. And how could they use that imagery? Well, because God used that imagery in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. He connected adultery and murder to idolatry. So the idea of, mixing Yahweh worship with pagan worship, having idols in your Yahweh temple, that's like idolatry. That's like taking someone else into your bed that only your spouse belongs into. How about murder? Well, James actually is the one who helps us understand this. It's in James chapter 2. Why don't I just go ahead and just pull it up? In James chapter 2, you have mention of the Ten Commandments. James, by the way, is another witness to the ancient ordering of the commandments. You do not commit adultery, and then do not murder. So there's James referencing the original wording, the original order of Exodus 20. But it's also then in James that he kind of gives this really cool elaboration about murder in particular. Where did I go? James, come back, James. By the way, James is actually my namesake, my middle name. That's where I get it from, named after the first bishop of Jerusalem here, who's writing this. But so now I'm trying to see where it is here. So it's actually in here when he's talking about murder. There it is. it's where he's talking about murder, that he actually goes and he connects this. Sorry, I went too far again. To the idea of God and His name, and so I'm just failing at finding this like reference here. The image is it's the image of God idea. So it's basically saying like, how can you possibly be thinking about murder for someone who's created in the image of God? Now I can't even find that verse there. So where is that? Let's see. Trusty Google will help me. Murder someone in the image of God. Where is that verse? I thought it was James. Is it not? I mean, of course, it's in Genesis, right? I mean, it goes back to, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. I mean, of course, it goes back to Genesis. I thought it was James made the point somewhere in here, too. I'm not going to read over James any more than I already have, but basic idea being there, right? Like, it's actually part of the reason why you don't make an idol, you don't make an image, right? Because God already made an image. It was humanity. So how could you, think about that. Like setting up foreign images, right? Foreign idols is sort of like the other side of the coin of then destroying the image that God himself has made, which is humanity. So murder and adultery are right there at the very beginning, and they're actually put there because they are the most serious commandments on this back half. In terms of natural law, the worst possible things that you can do in the natural order are murder and adultery, which there it is, guys. That's the thing that no one wants to admit in 21st century America. And in fact, in Exodus 20, what came first? In Exodus 20, adultery. It's actually listed as the worst possible thing you can do in the created order. And we would put adultery last in our society, right? No fault divorce and all the rest of it. But adultery, it is a reflection of our hearts and a reflection of godlessness, faithlessness. I mean, to use our Lord's comparisons, right? If you can't have faith with a human being, how are you supposed to keep faith with God? So, and of course there's forgiveness even for adultery, right? I mean, just think about the Lord who forgave the woman who was caught in adultery, or who interacted with the Samaritan woman who had been married several times and was just living in adultery, right? So there's forgiveness. There is forgiveness for idolatry, of course, right? God didn't just kill Aaron when he sets up the golden calf, but it's actually the most serious, listed as the most serious in Exodus chapter 20. So, going back to Exodus 20, or I guess, you know what? I was pulling up James in my copy, but yours is actually still set. Yeah, it's still over there, and that's fine. Let me resynchronize my tabs here so that you guys are actually looking at the same thing I'm looking at. There it is. Whoop. We just jumped over to James. Bonus points to whoever can find the thing in James that I was looking for. It's somewhere in chapter 4. I just don't feel like reading the whole thing right now. So then let's make the last couple connections and end this for now. So you've got murder and adultery then as the 6th and 7th commandments. In Exodus 20, the order is not that essential because they go together as a pair. That's probably how they got flipped then in Deuteronomy 20, or one of the reasons why they kind of felt the freedom to flip them, because the order was not that important. It's just the pair is, right? It's kind of more of a visual chart thing than like a number thing. So then, 8th and 9th commandment, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And I won't repeat everything that Pastor Birkholz said in our episode earlier today, but of course, there was a really good explanation that he offered, and one that I alluded to in Luther about how stealing and false witness are connected to each other, and of course how they're connected to the name of God, swearing a false oath, right? And so there you have falsehood in your oath connected to falsehood in your testimony against your neighbor. And the two, of course, are very naturally linked, and they're linked to theft, as we talked about in the episode today. So then finally, coveting, and I won't also repeat it, but Pastor Birkholz gave a good explanation too about how, hey, why do you covet your neighbor's house and all his stuff, right? How do you know that that's what you're doing, that you're coveting? Well, it's because you're working all of your people and all of your stuff on the Sabbath day, right? You can't have a holiday because you just want to keep up with the Joneses. So coveting is actually presented as the reason why people do not keep the Sabbath. So that is stuff that for us that is super, I think, insightful, because like I was saying in the episode today, we think of ourselves and we're like, oh no, I don't covet things. I don't like try to like take things from people, or like, oh, I wish I could have that. I'll just buy one on Amazon, no problem, right? No, it's about, are you so covetous of this person's stuff that you just have to keep working and working and working and putting aside other more important things, putting aside the priorities of God so that you can have those things too? And that's the idea of covetousness, right? And so in that way, when we can see the structure that's in Exodus 20, it really does speak to us in our own 21st century situation. So that's one of the reasons why I get really excited about structure, because I think that when you can see structure, you can then more easily see how that same structure maps onto our contemporary modern situation. Whereas if you just kind of like know, like, oh, well, there's these commandments and they say certain things, and they mean certain things, and they're in this particular order, you might just kind of think like, oh, they're just particular for Israel and they don't really matter for us, right? But then you miss it. So, all right, that was quite the bonus episode. That was like 30 minutes practically. But I hope that that explains it, right? So there you have it, right? There's your 10 commandments. In Exodus chapter 20, the order being a little bit different from what you're used to. Not to say that the order is not attested anywhere else, by the way, guys. Don't misunderstand. Actually, if you just go to the Septuagint, right, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it puts adultery first, for example. Though it commits another boo-boo. Speaking of that, but if you go, for instance, to if you even go to Deuteronomy 5 in the Septuagint, it actually lists it: adultery, murder, steal. That's what you have in one of our earliest Hebrew papyri, the Nash Papyrus. There's some allusions to it in other Greek translation texts. So there's actually kind of a lot that points to that being the original order, without going into like too much more detail. Also, just like, again, it's in the New Testament. So I mentioned Romans 13. You got the same thing in Luke 19. Do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness, honor your father and your mother. And isn't it interesting that the Lord speaks that way? He goes adultery, murder, steal, false witness. You know what? I'm just going to stop and I'm just going to summarize the back half of the commandments, right? Honor your father and your mother, because that is the summary, the God-given summary of the back half of the commandments, right? So this connects a lot of dots for me anyway, and it helps me understand the 10 Commandments a lot. So hopefully you find that to be helpful. I know last week we had some questions about the actual numbering of the 10 Commandments and like what numbering do I prefer. Actually I prefer this one. I think this one's the kind of original brilliant one that makes the connections between our faith in God and then the way that we treat other people. I think it's just, there's no more beautiful elaboration on the connection between natural law and then the revelation of God than Exodus 20, 10 Commandments. But they didn't put me in charge of, the new Catechism edition, probably for good reasons. So anyway, if you have any questions or comments or follow-up questions, go ahead and put them in the box. I don't think I saw any on me doing this live right here. Just double check. Yeah, no, I don't think anybody chimed in. That's fine. Yeah, but so just if you think of anything else, I'll do another one of these little kind of online-only follow-up videos again, just because there isn't enough time to talk about some of these kind of big ideas that are honestly like a little bit intensive on like the Hebrew Greek side of things. Like, I mean, this is stuff that I can see because I'm like reading it in Hebrew, which, most people aren't. And I don't expect every single guest pastor to like read along in Hebrew, though a lot of them do. Nabil Noor is one of them. He's reading along the whole thing in Hebrew. So anything that he says, you should like listen to twice. So anyway, thanks for following along, guys. In half an hour here, we're going to record another episode, and I'll try to get a video recorded so that we can post that on the same day that it airs live on KFUO. So Till then, take care. Also, I neglected to thank our underwriters at the Lutheran Heritage Foundation on our live episode today. You should check out their website, lhfmissions.org. If you haven't gone there, one of these days I'm just gonna just go there and take some time on the show to do it. But they got a cool website. If you go there right now, they got just right in their front page, boom, the bigger picture, South Sudan, right? And it's talking about what's going on there, how they're dealing with the virus, right? And that's so good to get out of our own thing and say, hey, wait a second, it's not just people in the United States who are dealing with this virus. I mean, can you imagine what it's like in Africa and South Sudan, right? And organizations like the Lutheran Heritage Foundation are doing something about that. So check them out, lhfmissions.org. All right. Okay. Until the next one, guys, again, questions or comments, just go ahead and post them there. Maybe I'll be able to have a chance to answer them. Take care. Peace.